All right. Today on the podcast, we have Nate Fischer, who is the CEO at New Founding, which is their tagline is "Build the America You Want to Live In." It's a venture firm for American vitality. So thanks, Nate, for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
And more importantly, you're a father of four. So that's why I wanted you to have this on this podcast. Soon to be father of five. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's so many things that I want to kind of maybe hit on today. So I was kind of struggling with where to start. Maybe obviously we'll weave in what New Founding is doing and what you're doing, but I'm curious, just as the political climate and kind of what's going on today, what do you feel like history class has gotten wrong?
History class has gotten wrong. That is a good question. It's interesting. I was homeschooled and probably had a fairly unconventional upbringing, even in the early days of my understanding of history. So I I'll go with where the conventional narrative has gone wrong, even if that's never really been the view I was taught. I think there's a assumption fundamentally there's an assumption of liberalism and of this sort of arc of history that aligns with a liberal view of the world, really a post World War II set of norms, and sort of assumes the sort of steady ascendance of a set of post World War II norms that is it's not just wrong, it's dangerously wrong. And I'll actually use, I don't talk a ton, I don't even have a particularly strong opinion about sort of details of Middle East policy, for instance, but I, I posted something after last week after the attack on Israel. And in many ways, I think Israel has been constrained based on a set of liberal assumptions. It's been constrained from doing what probably it's needed to do to protect itself. And those assumptions relate to, I guess, normalizing a degree of multiculturalism. And yet you clearly have cultures over there that are not compatible with
Mm-hmm.
a certainly a sort of Western civilized approach to life. And I think that those constraints don't just, it's sort of easy to acknowledge them when you see something like this in Israel. But in many ways, I think they shape our entire view of the world and the framework within which we consider a whole range of policies, a whole range of approaches to the world and to life. And uh, they sort of wash they reject consideration of things that through most of history would have been recognized as key distinctions and key uh, problems that need to be confronted.
So what do you mean? So when you talk about multiculturalism in that context, but if you kind of zoom out with multiculturalism with history class, it seems to me there's a lot of discussion about that, and that is a predetermined kind of assumption of it as a ultimate good in some ways, and that's really seems to me as it played a big role in kind of where we find ourselves. Could you expand on that a little bit? As you mentioned it here with the Israel conflict.
Yep. Well, so I think the assumption is that we're moving toward an era where the traditional cultural divisions, let's say religion and others, are religion, ethnicity, all of that, are diminishing in importance. And I don't think that's true. I think that I mean, I actually like to going back to sort of the venture side, right? Facebook's mission until relatively recently was to make the world a more open and connected place.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this belief, and it's a continuation of the progressive belief that technology can help facilitate this move toward an open world, toward a world that sort of moved past these old divisions. And uh, I think that's clearly, very few people would say that that has been the trajectory of the last decade. That I think was a assumption built into much of our worldview, and it's one that I think is proven false. And so, what you actually have is you actually have people with sharply different, perhaps irreconcilable values and norms. And certainly they've been brought into proximity with each other, forced into proximity with each other. Things like the internet, the digital world tends to break further, facilitate interaction, and yet their beliefs about the world remain irreconcilably different. And I think that the sooner we recognize that, and I think it goes similarly to a non, and this actually ties into things like parenthood, right?
Mm-hmm.
It goes with a non-judgmentalism about culture. If you're non-judgmental about culture, that must be built on the assumption that cultures are equally good, uh, presumably compatible with each other, and something that we can kind of move past and focus on other things. And I think that that entire framework of the world, which shapes everything from parenting to foreign policy and border policy, is catastrophically naive and increasingly apparently so.
So it's almost the assumption that you can't label any other culture as inferior in any sort of way. It's just a matter of misunderstanding. And so the assumption is that there's like, if we can connect people, that we'll all kind of just get along. Is that kind of what you're describing? And then that hasn't proven true.
Yeah, misunderstanding plus I think an element of education. Look, if we just educate people, if we just propagandize people with these sort of values of tolerance, if we educate people, they will adopt. They'll progressively adopt the dogmas of tolerance, the dogmas of liberalism, and they'll all get along with each other. Exactly. That if you educate kids, and I think it actually applies. It applies to a similar view that if you educate kids, they will choose goodness.
Yeah. And that's very false.
It's very false. You need to morally raise kids, and you need to discipline kids, and you need to likewise morally judge morally judge practices and cultures, and recognize that some of them are compatible with a vision we have, and some of them are not, and some of them would need sharp changes to be able to live in peace with our vision of life.
Yeah. That's interesting. You say you're homeschooled. I must have missed that, but I was homeschooled for a short time, and then we homeschool our kids. And I've always fascinated by the kind of socialization, argument against homeschooling. And I've always responded, well, you're just saying you want the chance to indoctrinate my children, and you think I'm not doing a good enough job indoctrinating them with your dogma. and and I think that that's really key, because there's like an understanding that it it kind of goes to that education piece. Like you're not doing a good job as a homeschool parent, opening their eyes to all the things that are out there. And if you would, then it would ultimately be, you know, a good, essentially, for the child.
Yep. Well, and I think the socialization one it's mixed in. They use socialization, and socialization is something that sort of naturally resonates. But you push on it, and what they really mean is they actually do want to they do want to shape kids with a uh, broad doctrine. And you actually think of the early purpose of public schools, and my understanding is the very early public schools were designed to essentially catechize people with a standard civic education, a standard that they were really designed to facilitate an assimilation of immigrants and such. And it's understandable. I think it's something that could have virtues if what you're doing uh, is socializing them into shared and virtuous cultural norms. The problem is that we, to some extent, I homeschool as well right now, and to a large extent, we do so because we don't have shared and virtuous cultural norms that are being taught to them.
So how did a nation that was founded on immigrants. So the case is often said, well, we're a nation of immigrants, so we should be open to all of these different cultures, and that kind of starts to make the case for multiculturalism in some ways that it's presented. So if we're a nation of immigrants, yet now we're saying, I guess what has changed when you talk about new founding, what you're really leveraging, at least from my vantage point, is you're kind of saying we need to return to that founding, that we're founding it again almost, but we're leveraging that like spirit of American vitality. What changed from then to now in terms of how we embraced the immigrants, and like you were saying, like catechize them, but we something fundamentally changed. Was it an absence of a shared goal or a shared direction? Do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fundamental question. What, to some extent, what does assimilation mean too? And I'll actually, going back to the sort of what the history books get wrong thing, my impression is the sort of nation of immigrants framing itself was actually a something that really changed post World War II, and that's not how Americans thought of themselves. We didn't think of ourselves predominantly as a nation of immigrants for much of our history. It would have been a nation with a distinct set of values. It was still, I think, it was still somewhat propositional. It was very It was very Anglo-Saxon identity, even though it was a somewhat broader group. But it was a particular branch of that I think defined a national spirit and a national vision. And there was an expectation that a lot of people would embrace that as they got here. And I think, yes, if we're going to nation of immigrants is sort of a descriptive thing, and you turn that into an ideal, and you're actually, in many ways, sort of eliminating any sort of, other than the sort of narrowest propositions, any sort of description of what people should become. My view with new founding is we do need a new positive vision, and the right framed as conservative was mostly about sort of limiting the pace of change toward that, but it wasn't about defining a different or alternative positive vision for our national identity, for who we are. What I
Why,
think we
why is
need, what I
that?
think
Like why is there lack of positive identity of like vision? Sorry
it's
to
a
cut
good
you off there, Nate.
question. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think to some extent the conservatives. I think that conservatism as a defining identity on the right itself is focused on preserving the good things of the past rather than vying for a different vision of the future. I like to say America was founded with a distinct vision of the future. You think of the late 18th century, and you had the American Revolution, you had the French Revolution, and those are two both forward-thinking, forward-leaning visions of the future. Some would say they're sort of closer than I think we like to imagine. I don't know that I buy that. I think in many ways you read the American founders, and they had a deep grounding in understanding of human nature. They had a vision that was both very forward-thinking and aspirational, but deeply grounded in a correct understanding of human nature. Whereas you think of the French Revolution, it was a revolutionary rejection of human nature and embrace of the perfectibility of man in a way that has historically always led to totalitarianism. So, for much of America's history, I think America was not defined by any sort of conservatism. The conservatism presumably would have been sticking with England and sort of
Yeah.
sticking with the uh, the good things of the past, a classic sort of truest conservatism. So in many ways, I think it wasn't again until largely post World War II that that became the defining aspect of the right, is this conservatism. In many ways, conservatism was imported largely, I think, from England as a way of looking at the world. So why that triumphed, I don't know that I guess I don't know all the intricacies of why that triumphed, but I think it was a way that really made our movement at peace with the general sort of progressive liberal direction of the country. We no longer vied for a fundamentally different vision for the country, which really is it's a conflict of visions. It's a sharp conflict, and settled into something that was much more of a let's preserve the good things of the past, which actually can fit very well with a particular progressive vision. We vie over the pace of change. We don't vie over the direction. I think we're at a point where people increasingly recognize that's not a viable option. That we have we have irreconcilable visions at this point. We're not content to just slow it down. The right has recognized that's a losing strategy, and yet I think we don't have decades of development of an alternative vision. Our movement has not uh, really fleshed out what an alternative should look like, and you see a lot of, I think, vibrant conversations happening in that space, but they're not well developed. It's not easy to just import from somewhere else. America has a very distinct heritage, a very distinct culture. In many ways, a culture that itself is aligned with sort of technological change and commercial advance and all of that. And so, what does a non-left version of that look like? I think it's fun. I think actually, why am I in venture? I'm in venture partially because venture is actually a really great platform for answering a lot of those questions. A lot of what goes into it at the very essence is envision things in the future that we want to see and build them and make them happen, mobilize resources behind them. And so it's an exciting and vibrant conversation, but it's also one that's still in the early stages.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make and to continually talk about, in my opinion. Like you said, there's a lot of vibrant conversation happening around what is the positive vision for the future, and kind of how did we get here? Because I think that's such an important thing. There seems to be so much noise around what we're not, or trying to demonize founders, like our founding fathers, or Christopher Columbus, or all these, they were like ripping down these statues, and it's like you're starting to erode the any of the voices that were the ones that were talking about that, positive future and outlook. And so there's so much noise on that side of, media, or what have you. And to me, that's such a key lacking piece, and that's something I'm so curious about. Right? Why is there not more discussions around that? One of the things that I had a guy on the podcast that was talking about, the view as it relates to like a family. There's this seemingly a shift the last like several decades, or even just say the last 30 years, where the view of a family, instead of it being viewed as a team, and you're talking about kind of a multi-generational team that you want to build in a legacy, it's more about a nest that you want to kick kids out of, and you just want to kind of get that to that stage. And how that the fundamental shift on thinking and how you think about your family is kind of a related to what we're talking about here, because it impacts everything that you do and how you kind of approach it. And for me, that was really powerful to hear and to internalize and say, okay, how am I saying this to my kids all of the time, and casting this vision for, hey, this family is a team, and we're gonna have a positive impact. We're gonna do things, and we're thinking multi-generationally, as opposed to just, we're got to get you guys graduated out of the house, and you got to go do your own thing. you know does that resonate with you?
No, it does, and I think in many ways, I think the second half of the last century in particular was a very consumeristic. It aligns with a very consumeristic vision of life, right? Your goal is to the extent you have a family, it's sort of it's a cost on that, or it's something that you do to a certain level based on you have a couple of kids because that fits sort of a desired vision of life or whatever. But then you quickly sort of move beyond that and get to ultimately retirement is ultimately sort of this pure consumption vision and that vision of life. And I think it fits with a nation that doesn't care much about it. It fits with a culture that cares little for legacy, and I think has very little respect for heritage. And those two go together, right? If you have very little respect for fathers, you also it's a very present focused, consumption focused culture, and that is in many ways the pathology of the era we're coming out of. Certainly, in many ways, on both the right and the left. Actually, I mean, the right certainly paid lip service to far more than that, but in many ways, a lot of its policy got reduced to, in some ways, you could think sort of the common denominator that the left can largely be happy with, which is increasing GDP and increasing income and facilitating consumption and all of that, which isn't a meaningfully different distinction, meaningfully different vision.
Yeah. Yeah. So what, as you kind of think about the positives of the current state of the movement, my natural question I think a lot of people are asking is like why has the right like ceded power, you know, to the left and this progressivism? And then so I mean I think we could talk a lot about that, but I'm curious like what do you see happening that are the quote white pills that maybe normal everyday people aren't seeing? So if everyday
Yeah.
people are seeing, you know, all of the chaos that's going on, all of the division and seeing like where is this country headed, and what are you seeing, you know, having your ear to the ground a little bit more on the venture side? I know you're pretty plugged in politically. Can you speak to that a little bit of some of the white pills that are out there that are happening and where are they happening?
So the biggest one for me is actually moving on from I think, from a legacy view that increasingly we recognize led to failure. And ultimately, I see a lot of, so the biggest one is I see a lot of fragility in the left. I think the left is increasingly, they have lots of contradictions in their own coalition. They are, they're rightly paranoid that their regime is a lot more fragile than I think many people assume. It's something that is it's built on a bunch of assumptions that are increasingly untenable, and merely having a right that is sort of uh, renewing discussion of positive alternatives is there's a good chance that that leads to something that matters. It's not something it's not like we see the immediate path yet, but we see energy around that. It's no longer constrained by things that have held it back from meaningfully challenging the left. You see the left's coalition, and I think just in this last week, uh, uh, the week after the Hamas attack on Israel, I think you actually see a lot of fissures in the left's coalition, demonstrating the weakness of their coalition. What is a viable alternative we provide? I don't know that we have a well developed one yet, but you have people talking about the right things, asking the right questions, and that's exciting. Another, I think, white pill is, and this is sort of what interests me in the venture space, is I think technology can actually be our friend. Technology is certainly something that the right has not is traditionally associated with the left. A lot of people are very suspicious of it. A lot of parents are very suspicious of it. In general, it's something that I think conservatives are inherently suspicious of. If your goal is to preserve the good things of the past, technology, in some sense, technological disruption invariably leads to the loss of some of those norms. But if we have a positive vision, then disruptive technology can be one of the most powerful forces to get us there. If you have a fragile incumbent and you have disruptive technology, and you are using that technology as a lever to achieve something desirable and positive, you're not chasing the technology for the technology's sake, but you recognize it as a powerful lever. That is one of the things that can fairly rapidly reshuffle the deck in a sense. It can fairly rapidly change a status quo that right now seems to be so thoroughly in the hands of the opposition and of our opposition. And so I think that creates exciting possibilities. You see some of that excitement in the crypto and the Bitcoin world, regardless of whether some of the proposed solutions there are necessarily going to be the ones that drive this change. I think you see a space where people recognize the power of technology to change things, and recognize, they talk about the sort of regime level questions, and that's a world of possibilities and excitement. And if things are very grim, the grimmest would be a sort of steady path on the status quo with a steady consolidation of power by the left. But I don't see that, and I think they also recognize that that's not a likely trajectory,
Yeah.
which terrifies them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good, you know, I think you're absolutely spot on with technology being kind of feared by the right or conservatives because it's a change. So it's antithetical to kind of what they stand for. If you're saying you're gonna conserve the current state and not, pursue this, change. But much like a a power saw in the hands of the right person can do a lot of good. In the hands of the wrong person can do a lot of bad. You can build a house really fast, with technology. So I think that's important. Um, you mentioned the looking at the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Some of the other things I hear talked about a lot is like the Bolsheviks and that sort of like history. So if we're looking at, I hate to dwell on what we're not, but at the same time, there's a lot that needs to be educated on of like kind of what we're dealing with in terms of like our period in history. And I'm curious, if you could speak to kind of that discussion around how right now relates to the Bolsheviks, or even just some educational things like examples to look at, resources, that sort of thing, to help kind of set a proper, appropriate framework for kind of what's going on in state of change in the country.
Yes. Well, I think that's instructive about in many ways. It's instructive about who the left are and what they do. And you look at, I think the Bolsheviks. I think the Cultural Revolution in China is another one. But there's this steady. You certainly saw this in 2020, summer of 2020, but you really see this as I think a repeated pattern of the left is they are revolutionaries. They are tearing down. They often are supported by a wide range of people who are going to ultimately be destroyed by them. There's actually, you think of resources. There's an article that I found really interesting on. It's in First Things, and it's an article about the lead up to the Russian Revolution and how widely intellectuals, professionals, even business elites were widely supporting the Bolsheviks, and it was a very trendy thing to do. A lot of like BLM. Uh, Ultimately, people who were totally destroyed by that movement, and so I think it's instructive to look at history and realize how uh, broadly people can support self-destructive things. It's also instructive to realize what these movements lead to and how they're not there's no necessary pendulum that'll just swing back. I think a lot of people assume a pendulum will swing back. It can be incredibly destructive. The course that these things lead to if left unchecked, and it's a sobering warning sign. It's something that I think broadly has woken people up over the last few years. People who saw they saw a trajectory they may not have liked, but they really stayed deeply sort of governed by a very constitutional view of the world. Ultimately, our job is to preserve the Constitution. Our job is to operate as sort of the principled alternatives. And I think increasingly recognizing that our opponents are not governed by any sort of constraints like this, and their goals are revolutionary, and there's a very clear pattern that you see today that matches what you saw 100 years ago, and that I think that wakes people up to enter this fight, which again, fighting is not a natural stance of conservatives. Conservatives largely want to be left alone. I think people on the left, they get fulfillment from fighting in the political space, and that I think has woken people up.
Yeah, you said they get fulfillment from. That's another thing I'm curious about, like the lack of the fight in the right, and but yet the abundance of fight in the left, and that dynamic is interesting because there seems to be a lot of identity on the fight of kind of what you're against on the left, or what oppression you're trying to come down on, and is why we kind of talked about it a little bit, just the dynamic of why the fight is not there on the right. It's just I can't get over it. It's like frustrating.
Yeah. So I think it's several things. I would say one is as a movement defined by conservatives. I think conservatives by nature really are not. They're not drawn to the political in the same way. So for the left, politics in many ways it is their church as well. It's more
Mm.
than just. It's more than that is their sense of fulfillment. Their eschatology is shaped by a sort of progressive arc of history, and by fighting for progressive politics, they are in many ways sort of ushering in this perfected world, which provides a deep sense of meaning. And in many cases, if you have a revolutionary progressive viewpoint, then progressive revolution itself, I would say 50 years ago that was an optimistic vision by the left, that we would usher in this world that is shaped by these values. Increasingly, I think that that's proved unfulfilling. They've been disillusioned by that. So now, in many ways, that's been replaced by something where there's a fulfillment that comes from continual revolution, even without a view that you're actually leading to something necessarily better. You're tearing down and attacking what is seen as injustice without necessarily having a compelling positive vision of what you're aiming for, which is both. I think it's both increasingly dangerous. They're no longer focused on building things, but it's also actually much less inspiring. I mean, that vision fails to inspire, which I think creates opportunity for us. I think people limited to conserving good things, they don't want to fight in politics. They don't want to put their energy in. They want to put their time into enjoying the good things they're conserving. Uh, a movement that has more than that, a movement that has a positive vision. You think of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are driven to go build something in the future. If part of what you build is a technological tool, or an organization, vision of organization that is shaped by that vision, you have that entrepreneurial type, which is sort of a deeply American uh, uh, type that will throw themselves into realizing that. I think with a vigor that is, and an intensity that is every bit as powerful as anything that the left pushes on the revolutionary side. So I think part of it is the framing of our movement has been why people are unmotivated. It's not a very it itself is sort of anti. I guess another way to put it is the right has been in some ways anti-political. It's embraced a set of principles that are almost anti-political. They're opposed to the process itself. It's governed by a set of principles without a real appreciation for the process of taking over institutions, influencing institutions, uh, thinking about fights in political terms. Are these people friends or enemies? Are they people we should be rewarding, etc. So you have a kind of a couple of self defeating Uh, ideologies almost held by people on the right, and you have the absence of a positive vision that actually inspires an alternative. Now you have the right throwing off those constraints and embracing a positive vision and drawing entrepreneurs who feel passionately drawn to building this future they want to live in, which I think is deep innately in man's nature. You think of Genesis 1, and we're called to fill the earth and subdue it, take dominion, and that entrepreneurial urge to create. You're channeling what God did in Genesis 1. I mean, it's one of the most fundamentally human things, is to create something out of nothing, to create something that helps fill the earth and subdue it and take dominion. Again, very fundamental to our nature, and I think draws and inspires people in a way that we're only beginning to see the power of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on there. To wrap it, kind of go even higher. Wrap it in the greater story, and the story of creation is like God is a God of creation. Satan is of destruction. And he wants to do everything to eliminate reproduction, whether it's physical reproduction, reproduction of believers, all of that stuff. So it's definitely an evil, I think, that is at work. Because it's an anti-creative, anti-creation, um, you know, end game, and that's infiltrated all of
Yes,
that.
that's why we've embraced the word vitality as a part of this American vitality. I think vitality is uh, ultimately a product of human channeling the higher aspects of our nature, our creation, the image of God. God created, we create, and that creation can be everything from entrepreneurial creation, uh, cultural and civilizational creation, uh, procreation, creating families, to to sort of national expansion. All of those, I think, are reflections of the same vital instinct, uh, the same giving of our life and channeling of our life into something that creates more. And I think that is in many ways the opposite of the left. The left has embraced a revolutionary destruction, an anti-human ideology that is helping draw a very, very clear contrast here.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a little bit biased, but I think, having a family is the best microcosm distillation of that, because you're thinking long term. You are creating an environment for your kids. You're talking about a creative endeavor, not only to have the children,
Mm.
but then to build them and mold them into the people that they should be. And I think that's foundational to, I think, a healthy society, right? To have people that are doing that on a micro level, that then it's basically a group of those small microcosms that are coming together and saying, hey, we are united behind a positive vision of the future as a collective of families that are in this nation.
Yep, the intergenerational aspect, and this is where I think Burke makes a great point, which is that ultimately it's you have this compact between the dead, the living, and the not yet born, and ultimately we recognize that intergenerational nature of civilization. We recognize good things of heritage, both both sort of objective and prudential goods, and the fifth commandment, the honoring your father and your mother, and the and the I think the future that we are providing, the legacy that we're leaving, and the value of the value and importance of that heritage, which involves passing on both literally the raising of our kids, the building of a family, but also the material things that we're passing on to them, and leaving an inheritance. That's a good thing, to leave an inheritance. It's curious that in the last I think few decades, you've seen the trendiness of not passing on inheritances to kids. It's very, I would say, it's an anomaly in human history to think that it's actually a good thing to sort of leave your kids on their own, and it's better for you to give your money to charity or whatever. That's one. I think it's good to leave an inheritance, and the Bible references that too,
Mm-hmm.
and likewise a cultural inheritance and institutional inheritance. We build a nation that is culturally rich, that gives them a heritage to enjoy in many other ways, and institutionally, we give them stable institutions. We fight the wars that need to be fought and the battles that need to be fought, so that they don't need to. That would be, I think, forget where I saw this, but someone referenced it. Only how much of a coward do you have to be to put off a war? You know that there's an enemy that needs to be confronted. You know that there's a war that's going to be fought, and you willingly choose to put it off until your children's day rather than fighting it today. That's a horrible thought, that we're going to force them to fight that. And by taking those things on, we are leaving them an inheritance of peace and stability, or we're hoping to do so.
Yeah, that's very important. Nate, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate your time today, and the insight you brought. And I love what you're doing, and want to support any way that we can to new founding. So,
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
all right, well, take care.
Take care. Bye.
So we'll call.